I drew the outline for the daisies with an HB pencil onto this smooth watercolour surface, and now I'm applying blue masking fluid with an old brush. It's a synthetic brush, and I've actually dipped it into hand soap so it protects the brush while you're using the masking fluid. And I'm just painting on the whole of the daisies, including the centre, so I can really freely sort of paint my background wet in wet later. So I'm just going to fill in here, take my time with the masking fluid here. If you drip any onto the surface where you don't want it, let it dry naturally, then peel it off. Sometimes if you wipe off masking fluid, wet masking fluid, and try and clean it up, it leaves a residue on the watercolor paper, and it always seems to resist the paint after that, but you can't actually rub it off. And make sure you allow the masking fluid to dry naturally. Whatever you do, don't blow dry, because it's very difficult to remove the masking fluid afterwards. Now, you don't have to mask out. You could paint around these daisies. The only thing I would find is they're quite fiddly, especially the daisy on the left, so you might want to either draw them a bit bigger and sort of have bigger spaces in between some of the petals if you don't have masking fluid or you don't want to use it. And obviously you can have some white paint on standby at the end if some of your background colour does run onto the petals if you haven't used masking fluid. But this way I quite like using the masking fluid because it protects the white of the paper there, and I can just really let go with the wet on wet when I'm actually painting. So as you can see here, I'm just going to continue on applying the masking fluid to the entire daisies and let that dry naturally. So I'm squeezing out the Paynes grey. I've squeezed out some of the yellow. I'm just going to mix up some colours now for the background. So I'm starting off with some of the yellow, using a small brush to mix with, and adding lots of water to that as well. Really get because it's a large background, make sure you mix up plenty of colour. So that's the yellow. So I'm just going to have some yellow on its own, and now I've added the yellow to the Paynes grey here. They're quite creamy mixes because I'm going to wet the paper next, so I'll be working wet in wet, so that will dilute the paint again. So you've got to sort of take that into consideration, and I'll only be painting the background once, you'll be happy to know. So this way, make sure that you really get your darks in there as well. So I've added a little bit more Paynes grey and yellow. I'm trying to get a good green. I wasn't actually getting it with the Paynes grey, so I've decided to add some Phthalo turquoise. You could use Prussian blue or a cerulean or something to get a lovely green, or even green itself. So I've added some of that blue there to that middle colour. So it's the yellow Paynes grey and a little bit of that Phthalo turquoise. I'm adding a pinch more to this right hand mix there, which is a bit darker. So I've got yellow, I've got sort of a mid to dark green, and then a very dark green. And I'm wetting the paper now with clean water with my size 14 round black velvet brush, really giving the paper a good soak before I apply my yellow paint, which I'm doing here wet in wet, quite random. So don't worry about where you're going to place it, have fun with it. Now I know there's a lot of daisies in the background, and I'll be lifting off so it'll get that lovely bokeh effect, but here I want to add lots of yellow to create some warmth in the painting as well, because I felt it lacked it a little bit in the photograph. And now I'm applying that sort of mid-green colour, and of course it's going to mix a little bit as well with the yellow, so that's absolutely fine. So you can just push the colour around wet in wet. I'm actually just making a little bit more colour there, so it's a mid to dark green. Really fully load your brush and apply this paint wet into wet, and let it all sort of merge in to create a really nice soft atmospheric effect, you know, using wet in wet techniques. As you saw there, I added a little bit more of the Phthalo turquoise just to make a really bit stronger green there, and I thought I might paint some little circles as well, just to try things out. This technique is so new to me. I'm really enjoying it, and I loved what some of the members did on the Facebook page when they shared their amazing mushroom paintings with the bokeh background. They were amazing, so do check that out. A link for the Facebook members page can be found in the description below. But as you can see here, I'm continuing on painting darks on top of the daisies now, because when it's all dry and I take off the masking fluid, you've got a lovely contrast of dark and light with the petals really coming forward. I'm not entirely copying the photograph, I'm just interpreting it. So once you've got your darks on there, it's time to allow your painting to dry before you start lifting off to create the bokeh effect. So I'm using the magic sponge. It's a sponge that you can buy from an art supplier, but also you can get it from DIY stores, hardware stores, because it actually gets marks off painted walls as well in the house. So you can get one of those. It actually works out a lot cheaper. But I've cut my magic sponge up to smaller little squares, and I'm actually lifting off with clean water using the stencil and the magic sponge to lift off the paint, because watercolour isn't permanent. So I've actually swapped now to a natural sponge just to show you can use that as well. And another tip is to get a wide bowl of water. I don't know if you noticed there, but I did swap from my little trio pot to a larger bowl because it was very difficult to keep putting my sponge in and out of that little trio pot there. But I found the natural sponge and the magic sponge both worked well. And the other thing you saw me doing there was I was wiping off the stencil, because there was lots of drips of water on there. And I didn't want that to sort of affect the painting in any way. The other thing is, when you lift off with the sponge, do dab with your paper towel afterwards so you haven't got any residue liquid. A really good tip is to vary the size of your circles. That really works well. It looks so effective. If you don't have a stencil, you could draw in different size circles using coins or little circle shapes to draw around to begin with, and then lift off with a stencil brush or an old sort of hog hair brush, or even the sponge as well. And as you saw there, I'm overlapping some of the circles as well. It looks quite effective as it does so in photographs as well. And once you've finished lifting off your circles, allow your painting to dry again. What I'm doing here is I'm actually cleaning the surface of the masking fluid. It's got paint on there. Sometimes when you lift off masking fluid that's got paint on top, it can actually smudge the white of the paper underneath. So I'm actually cleaning it with a damp, clean paper towel to remove the residue watercolour. And then I'm going to allow the painting to dry again. Really make sure your painting is dry before you remove the masking fluid, because it could smudge your painting, or you could even tear your painting or your paper. So I'm lifting off using the paper towel, but you can sort of pull it off if it's on thick enough. But I have seen students do this where that actually does tear the paper as well, because the masking fluid's so stuck to it. So I find just rubbing it off with some paper towels seems to work the best. And I always make sure I don't get anything on the paper towel. It doesn't get mucky or dirty, because sometimes that can smudge the painting as well. But as you can see there, the masking fluid has worked really well. I'm just removing most of it now. It does create a little bit of a mess. If you don't like the mess, you could use masking tape or framing tape to lift it off as well. And that way the masking fluid sticks to the tape and it's less messy. But I don't really mind the mess. As you can see, I've got pencil lines there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove those and rub them out before I start painting. The only lines I will leave are sort of a very ghost line, so I can see where I'm going or where an individual petal crosses over another one. But it's a good time to remove very dark outlines there, because sometimes they show through under your painting and you can't get rid of them later. It's much more difficult. So once you remove the pencil lines, or most of them, and the masking fluid, start painting wet on dry, some yellow in the center there. So I'm painting it quite creamy to the left there, and to the right hand side there's more light on that center. So I'm going to dilute my paint with some clean water, as you see I'm doing there. Take that excess off and then just soften here with the clean water. So you still pick up the yellow, but it'll be a lighter wash, so it looks like the light's hitting that sort of right hand side of the center of the flower. So I'm painting the stems in wet on dry, using a mixture of the yellow, you could use a touch of the blue and the Paynes grey here, just varying the sort of tonal values, having it a little bit darker here and there and then a bit lighter at the bottom. And I've swapped now to my size 6 brush. I've just added a little bit more yellow at the bottom here. I'm having a bit of fun actually. I know it's only a stem, but I quite like sort of changing those tonal values and the colours as well, wet in wet. So I'm just painting the one in the middle here. Take your time with stems. These aren't too tricky because they're a bit wider, they're not too thin, so you can just sort of fill in a little bit more. And again, I'm just varying the colours using this size 6, working wet on dry to begin with, but then you can drop in other colours wet into wet as well. So I've decided to turn my painting upside down. I just thought it was easier to access it here. I felt I'd put my hand into the wet paint of those stems. So I'm applying water to begin with and then dropping paint into the water. And I did this a little bit on a tutorial I published recently of the kites, dropping colours into a wet surface and letting them travel a little bit. So I'm experimenting with that here as well. You don't have to do it, but I thought it was fun to show you as well. So it's just dropping in sort of lighter colours at the bottom, a little bit of darker colour towards the top. I've allowed my painting to dry naturally and I'm working wet on dry now using my size 6 brush with some of the green just around the edge here to the left to create some shadows, and it looks quite effective and makes it look a little bit 3D. So I'm just working on this daisy to the left here, adding a little bit of water to that dark wash there, and it travelled a little bit too much, so I've just got my paper towel on standby here just to soften that dark, and I'm going to allow my painting to dry. So I've gone back in again with my stencil, which you can do, you know, maybe that first part you might want to do a few and then decide if you want to add some more. But the other reason why I'm doing this, because I'm actually using some of that bokeh effect over the top of some of the stems as well, which I thought would be quite effective. So I'm just lifting off as well with the paper towel to get rid of any of the excess fluid there. And I must admit, it's such a fun technique. I almost have to tell myself to stop so I don't overdo it and lift off all the paint. So what I'm doing now is I'm just adding a little bit more yellow, wet on dry, to the centres there, just to build up a bit more warmth, and then working damp into damp to add a little bit more dark green, Paynes grey and yellow, just to build up that tonal value there, to create some depth in the centre of the daisies, and also some texture as well. As you can see there, I'm stippling a little bit with the tip of my size 6 brush to create some texture there. I'm doing so as well on the left hand side here, damp into damp, so it's creamy dark colour, so it doesn't run too much, so you've got a soft edge but it stays put and it doesn't move too much. So it's quite nice to do, and if you don't like it you can always lift off with a paper towel as well. And I think that's what I did on this one here. I thought that was a bit too much, so here I go, lifting off. But sometimes when you lift off it kind of leaves other residue marks, and it actually is quite effective. So I've just added a little bit more, just varying those marks as well. I think this one on the right hand side in the photograph has a lot more textured detail as well, so that's why I'm giving this one, the star of the show, a little bit more texture and detail. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry again, and I'm next going to paint some shadows on the petals, but not very much. I don't want my painting to look like grey daisies, so you've always got to leave a lot more white than you are comfortable with almost. You've got to exaggerate it. So I'm mixing up a very, very dilute turquoise with a touch of the Paynes grey and just painting this very thin light wash onto the surface of the daisy petals here and there, working wet on dry, but then you can soften and blend as well with some clean water, which is what I'm doing now as well. So remember, this is a very, very dilute wash. There aren't a lot of shadows on those daisies, so really sort of paint the minimum that you can. And I'm just sort of showing where perhaps one petal is behind the other as well, with a little bit of shadow, then softening as I paint. So you can allow your painting to dry again, so there's no danger of those petals bleeding into the centre, because what I'm doing in the centre is I just wanted to warm them up a little bit more, the centres, that even though they are quite like the photograph, I felt my painting lacked any warmth and I wanted to bring those sort of daisies forward a bit more. So I'm adding some red, cadmium red, permanent yellow, just use a red and a yellow, more yellow than red, and I'm just sort of painting in a little bit of this warm colour, stippling it into the surface there, wet on dry, just to give a little bit more detail but warmth as well, to bring them to life with this little bit of warm colour in the centre there, using my size 6 brush to finish off my painting. And I think I will leave it there for now. I'm just going to remove the washi tape. It does reveal a lovely white border, and it gives you time to assess to see if you need to do any more work to your painting. It gives you a much more of an objective point of view, and it also presents your work really well as well. And I'm really pleased with the washi tape. It doesn't seem to tear the paper, so that's good. So here's the finished painting. I'm really pleased with it. I love that bokeh effect. It's so effective, and I really love daisies. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. And if you want to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You'll get access to my exclusive tutorials and downloadable outline sketches, and you can cancel anytime. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.